We're gonna turn those live drums from this to this. All right, so starting with this kick, the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna gate it. See, I've got this gate right here. You want your attack really quick so that the transient comes through. And you could play with the hold, but you don't want your kick to be too long. So the release kind of fades it out, and you want to play with that until you get the length just right. But you probably want a shorter kick. You don't want a longer kick unless it's a really slow song. Next up, we got some EQ, and we're mostly carving out mid-range and adding a bunch of top end. Here's before. Here's after. Now, you can see I've lowered the gain quite a bit to try and gain match it, because an important thing in mixing is not tricking yourself by hearing something louder and thinking that it sounds better. Now, with drums, you can really get away with crazy EQ and carving things because they don't change notes. They're just the same note over and over. A bass or a vocal, you got to be really careful in the mid-range, especially the low mids, or else when they change notes, they'll sound thin. All right, next up, we got smack attack, and what this is just like a transient designer. I like using this on kick because I can really alter the sound without squashing it so much like a compressor would. And let me clarify that a transient designer is pretty much a compressor. It's just using different controls to help you get a compressed sound. So here's before, and here's after. And that's giving it a lot of it snap right off the beginning, and it's actually lengthening it because the gate made it kind of short. And so I was listening to the kick, and it's very direct sounding. I wanted to add some room sound to it. So I used slate trigger right here, which is a drum replacement, but I did not replace it. I'm just mixing this in. You can see at 50%, and I've got the level pretty low here. And what I've loaded up is this room kick sample, which sounds like this. During sections where you can hear just the kick, this really helps make things more natural. So before blending in the room sample, and then after blending in the room sample. Now sometimes you may just want to duplicate this track and put trigger on that separate track and put the blend all the way up so that you have a completely separate sample track to process. But in this case, I didn't find that necessary, and I just searched for the right room sample that complemented the kick. And the slate trigger samples are already processed and already sound great. So a lot of times you don't have to do much. And then I finished it off with a final EQ, and this is just mixing. This is when I'm listening to everything in full context, and I'm just hearing, oh, I just wish the kick had a teeny bit more low end. And these frequencies up here, you can see are actually little frequencies that I found annoying on the transient of the kick as it was clicking. They kind of sounded like cheap clicky frequencies, and so I did notch those out. This is kind of a special case because I was using this raw live kick and not using a sample. And you can see I've also boosted quite a bit of top end. So before this, after. Kick before, kick after. Next up, we got the snare top, starting off once again with the gate. Now I've got the attack at 2 here. That's because I found if I put it at 0 that the transient at the beginning of the note was a little too sharp. And this one you can see I did use some hold, and then the release is definitely longer because we're trying to get the full tail of the snare and not chop it off in a weird way. Before gate, after gate. Next up we got EQ, and you can see I'm going really aggressive with this EQ, and I'm going to explain why. And in order to try and get the cymbal out of here, this is where I really start cutting things in an unnatural way. That gets rid of the cymbal a bit, but this really gets rid of the cymbal, and you'll see what happens here. Now you really can't hear the cymbal, but of course that snare sounds way too dark, right? So what do? This is the secret sauce right here. We're once again using trigger, and we're blending in a couple of samples. We've got this direct sample here that's nice and bright. And then we've also got this room sample. These Slate room samples are recorded at some amazing studios. I believe it was NRG Studios. The drum rooms sound fantastic, and most people don't have access to these crazy drum rooms to record drums in, and a lot of times they're recording in smaller rooms. So if you implement these large room samples, you can create these huge sounding drums. So my main goal with adding these was to add the top end with the bright sample and to add the big room sound. So this is before, this is after. I couldn't get that bright of a snare without using that sample because the snare mic has so much bleed of the cymbals in it. So next up we got some compression to add a little snap to it, not so much to level it out, but to add some snap. And I use an 1176 because it's a FET compressor, and FET compressors are very quick, and I think that's why a lot of people like them. Because they're so quick, they're pretty transparent, and you can get a nice pop out of it, especially this black 1176. Before, after. Next up is some EQ from an SSL EQ, and the nice thing about an analog style EQ like this has more musical curves than if you're using something like the typical stock EQ. Just boosting some top end to take off the blanket over top, and some upper mids around 7K to add some bite. Before, after. And then just some final EQ at the end, doing this while listening in the context of the mix. This is the before. This is the after. Pretty bright. Snare before. Snare after. Next up we got the snare bottom, and I didn't do too much to this. I mostly wanted to bring out the high end of it and really squash it with some pleasing saturation. So we've got a noise gate before, after, and then this J37 is a nice tape saturation plugin. Sounds really smooth when you push it. Here's the before. Here's the after. Really pushed. But together with the snare top, here's without the J37. Here's with it. Subtle differences, but it really helped brighten up the snare. And in the context of the mix, that bright snare really cuts through. So these toms, something happened in the editing phase where they got edited a little too short, where the tail is missing, as you can hear right here. In the context of the mix, they did sound a little too short. So I went ahead and I did a full sample replacement. You can see the mix is all the way up here. And I replaced it with this sample here. And then I just did some EQ to help it fit in the mix. Before, after. Mostly just increasing the fundamental of the tom here, because these samples are already processed and sound great. Same thing with the second tom here. I've replaced it with this sample and used this EQ to fit it in the mix. Before, after. And let's listen to both the toms before and after. This is before, no processing. And this is after with the processing. Next, we have these overheads. And so there's something interesting going on here. If you listen to these overheads when they're panned out, listen to where the snare is. It's a little panned off to the side, right? So if the overhead microphones are not an equal distance from the snare, then the snare will not sound like it's in the center of the overheads. So to fix that, I use some time delaying, and in Logic, that's the sample delay. I played around with both of them, and you can see they actually both have separate values here. One is 52, one's 83, and I kind of just played with them until I got them to feel like the snare was in the middle. So here's with both of them off, and here's with both of them on. Next up, we've got some EQ here, and I've EQ'd these both the same. The main goal is to really dial out the low end and get rid of the snare and the kick completely from these, and treat this like a cymbal mic specifically. So before EQ, after EQ. I then listened with the snare, soloed with it, and I inverted the phase, and I liked the sound of it with the phase inverted on both better when mixed with the live snare. And then lastly, they just sounded like they were too close. So I delayed them both by 500 and it pushed them back to where it sounded more natural. So the overheads without any processing and with processing. Last but not least, we've got these room tracks here. And the first thing I've done is I've added an expander, which is similar to a noise gate, but it's not cutting the sound out completely. The idea with this expander is to really just have the snare be prominent in the room tracks and not have everything else be as prominent. So expander off, expander on. Next, we have some EQ. We're mostly cutting a lot of low end here to cut out any conflicting low end with the direct mics. EQ off, EQ on, and then we're finishing that off with an 1176 black, and this is without compression and with compression. So this is the room tracks without any processing and with processing. And then to finish it all off, we've got some bus processing here. What I've got here is some parallel compression. Using this H comp, it's got a mix knob so that I can do it parallel. And this is without it. And then with it. It really livens things up in a nice way. Next up, I've got some clipping. So this is without the clipping. And this is with the clipping. And that's to help the transients not stick out quite so much, but it really preserves the snare. A limiter kind of chops the snare, but when you use soft clipping, it really preserves that snare transient, but somehow still chops it. It's one of the mysteries. The black boxes, the Riddler's revenge, if you will. And then we got some EQ, just brightening things up a little bit. So here's without the EQ. And then with the EQ. And then I've got a limiter here just for those really high peaks, just catching those without. And then with. Now what really matters is how this sounds in the mix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bypass all the processing and we're going to listen to it in the full instrumental mix. Not bad, we got the faders where they should be, but now let's turn on the processing and listen to what that sounds like. I hope you learned something today. If you did, leave a comment down below and please click that subscribe button. I've got more and more videos coming out real soon, so be on the lookout for that, and thanks for watching.